Բարև ձեզ։ Գրադարանում այսօր զրուցում ենք ուկրաինական Kyiv Independent կայքի գլխավոր խմբագիր Օլգա Ռուդենկոյի հետ։ Զրույցը կլինի անգլերեն եւ մենք կունենանք հայերեն թարգմանություն։ Hello Olga, nice to meet you.
Hello, nice to meet you.
How your workflow has been changed since the February 24? How you shifted?
Well, just like for any Ukrainian, our lives changed completely after February 24th. We, as a newsroom, we moved to war coverage almost completely. It's for several months we weren't covering anything else apart from the war developments. Now we are trying to shift back to normal a little bit in the sense that we try to cover other stories that are important as well. We, like many organizations, had to partly evacuate from Kyiv. Most of us have left Kyiv in the first days of the invasion. And we were located in other parts of Ukraine mostly, although several people went abroad. Several people also stayed in Kyiv, and they were our reporting, force. They were mainly people who had experience covering the war in eastern Ukraine in the previous 8 years. So they had experience covering battlefield developments, and they were better prepared to do reports from outside Kyiv back in March, especially when this was the hottest place, and there was a serious risk that Kyiv would be taken. And since then, gradually, people have been returning to Kyiv, and now the whole team basically is back in Kyiv, apart from a couple of people. And we are working. Well, I can't say we're back to normal because nothing feels normal anymore, but we're doing our best to operate as close to normality as possible and to serve our readers well. And because, of course, the interest for the demand for our coverage, because what we do, we cover Ukraine in English. The demand for that kind of coverage, of course, grew exponentially since February 24th.
Do you have reporters in the front lines, and how do they work about safety and about their work?
We deploy reporters both to the front lines and to the key cities that are under attack but may not be frontline cities per se. Places like southern Ukraine, like Odessa and Mykolaiv, for example. Places like Kharkiv, which is under constant shelling, although it's not exactly a frontline city. And we do periodically deploy people to the front line. Unfortunately, access is very, very limited for journalists now. It is because the war is the fighting is much more intense than it's ever been in this 8 years of the war. The access is harder than it's ever been to the front line for journalists because naturally. Military commanders don't want to be responsible for a journalist being killed while they're embedded with their unit, so they limit access. And unfortunately, we see that I don't know what the latest story is. At least 8 journalists have been killed since the start of the invasion while performing their duties, and that doesn't include many journalists who were killed because they joined the fighting or they were there as volunteers and so on. So it's been a really hostile and deadly environment for journalists.
Kyiv Independent, well known for the journalistic investigations as well. Can you tell some interesting stories about your investigations or some of your findings, investigations, and so on?
Well, we are
about the war. I mean, about the war mainly.
We are currently expanding and really setting up the investigative department. We are hiring for that, so maybe there are international journalists who watch you and who will apply for a job with us. But we did two just in the beginning of last week, we put out a really interesting piece on an operation of Ukrainian intelligence, Ukrainian military that was not known before. The operation took place in June, and the purpose of the operation was to destroy a military base of the so-called Wagner group in eastern Ukraine. Wagner is an elite private military company that Russia uses in the conflicts that it participates in. And so our journalist discovered through his sources that a group of this Wagner mercenaries were deployed in eastern Ukraine and back in spring. And in June, they were taken out by a targeted Ukrainian military strike that became possible thanks to local civilians who were informing the Ukrainian military. And that was quite an amazing story that became a hit on the website. It was the demand for stories like that, war stories with investigative element, is very high.
We journalists sometimes have to publish some horrible stories, especially during wartime, human stories. What is influence of such kind of human stories on the life, and how it changed after the war, and how important for you to tell the human stories, and sometimes very, very tragic stories?
That's a good question. Human stories are, the backbone of our coverage. We, of course, even though we put out a lot of military analysis kind of stories about how the front line shifts and what Ukraine military is planning to do in the south, for example, still it is, at the bottom, at the center of any story, including a war story. There are always human lives and human fates. And we always try to seek out stories that speak to people, that show through an individual story shows the tragedy of the war. Because it's one thing to see the number. We put out reports about people being killed every day. Several people were killed in Donetsk Oblast in a missile attack this morning that hit an apartment building and I think a local hotel. It's just numbers when it's like that, but we have some very talented journalists on our team who are specifically seeking out people who have been affected, relatives of the people who were killed, families that evacuated from the affected areas. And we have many stories like that on the website where they're getting published constantly. We are now trying to interview a Ukrainian teenager who spent over a month in Russian captivity, and it's also a tragic story. It is, however, I would say that it is more challenging now than it used to be, because the audience is getting kind of used to the tragedy of the war, and we are trying to. It's a challenge that we have. We need to figure out how to tell the stories that they still, grasp people's attention and they really get to them.
Yeah, especially when you are doing English coverage, and for foreign audience, how to keep the attention, keep the audience.
Yes, absolutely, because the war fatigue is a real thing, and we see it very literally. We see the website numbers dropping compared to what they used to be in March, and we see that stories that we would think would have grasped people's attention are not really doing the job, because unfortunately it is very natural for anyone to get tired of stories like that, especially when they are stories that don't really, are not part of their everyday life, which is for most of our readers who are abroad. Stories about tragedies from Ukraine, they are not something that is, it's something that exists on their screen. It's not something that they see when they leave their home office. And we're constantly thinking about how we can find ways to bring the stories closer to them, to show, for example, writing about the influence of the war on the gas situation in Europe, trying to kind of bring the story closer to literally to the homes of the people who are reading us.
Let's speak a bit about ethics in journalism. Do you think has the war erased boundaries of the ethical journalism or not? How is the situation? What do you think?
Well, it is a very tough question. What is happening to journalism in Ukraine now is unprecedented. We are operating in the environment and in the conditions that we have never had to operate in before. It is sometimes said that the truth is the first casualty of war, and we really see it happening here. We at the Kyiv Independent believe that even though we're definitely not unbiased in this war. We're at the Kyiv Independent. We are Ukrainians or people who lived in Ukraine for a long time, and really, it is their country too. So we are, of course, not pretending to be balanced and unbiased. It would be ridiculous if we did so. But at the same time, we're not censoring ourselves. We're not connected to the government. We're not and we never will be a propaganda outlet. If we learn something that we think is important to be reported, to be brought to the light, and it doesn't, this piece of information doesn't make Ukraine look good necessarily. If we think that it is important, if we here as a newsroom, as a team, decide that this is important for the public to know, then we will report it. We're not censoring ourselves. At the same time, I do know that it is an internal struggle that many Ukrainian journalists are going through now, because they have allegiance to their country, of course, and there is a lot of discussion now happening about self-censorship, about journalists maybe sometimes trying to step back and avoid stories that can be seen as controversial. But I feel good about the fact that this discussion is happening in the journalistic community here, that we're talking about it. This is something that we as professionals care about. It's something that worries us, and that means that we will arrive at some balance, because it's not like we have a rule book. It's not like we have a script that we can follow, because as I said, it's unprecedented.
In what extent your job is not telling the stories from Ukraine for the foreign audience, but also combating Russian disinformation and telling the stories about Russian disinformation in English?
Yes, we even before this invasion, even when we set up the Kyiv Independent in November, 8 months ago, even then we still saw it was part of the mission. It was part of how we saw ourselves, that we are kind of a counterweight that Ukraine has for the Russian propaganda machine. We are, of course, it's of course David against Goliath, because Russia has been throwing millions of dollars into their foreign language coverage. RT has only been shut down in Europe now after this invasion, which is, if you ask me, is ridiculous. That was allowed to operate and bring Russian propaganda to foreign audiences for so long. And we did see, and we do see now ourselves as an important part of what Ukraine can offer to oppose, to outweigh, and the Russian propaganda. Of course, it's we can't do it alone, but we see ourselves as an important part of that, because telling, we're not fighting propaganda with propaganda. We'll never do that. I firmly believe that the truth is more powerful than propaganda, and if we just bring truthful stories to the world and factually based stories that were properly reported, fact-checked, and stories where we would have just done our normal journalistic work, I think that already is effective.
Thank you, Olga, for the very interesting and very honest conversation. Peace to all of us.
Thank you.